Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are excited to introduce you to Grails 4 on today's webinar. Your presenter is James Klee, a member of the core Grails team here at Object Computing. We will first cover what's new with Grails 4 and how that differs from Grails 3, including key upgrades and new features, what MicroNot Integration means for you, and what to expect from the upgrade effort going forward.
So, what's new? So previous versions, Grails 3 and below, supported Java 7, and that's no longer the case, which really should be of no surprise. Almost every library that's out there today, all the newer versions require Java 8. It's been upgraded to use Groovy 2.5. We would have loved to use Groovy 3, but unfortunately that's not out yet and probably won't be out until late this year. We've upgraded to Spring Boot 2.1. As you probably know, Grails is based off of Spring Boot. Every Grails app is a Spring Boot app. And we were using version 1.5 in Grails 3. And now Spring Boot 2, specifically 2.1, brings a whole bunch of improvements and new features that we can leverage. So we're upgraded to that. And Spring 5, which is the basis of Spring Boot. And we've also changed Gorm from a Gorm 6.1 currently. And we've changed it to be Gorm 7. And which now requires at least Hibernate 5.3 for the Hibernate implementation of that. And there's a bunch of changes in Hibernate that are relevant to your applications as well. Gradle 5 is the supported version of Gradle. So when you create an application with the Grails CLI, it will create a Gradle 5 build, right? And we've also updated all of our builds internally to use Gradle 5. And then also the MicroNot integration, which I talked about. So the overall theme of the overall sort of idea that I would like everyone to come across from this webinar is that the upgrade from Grails 3 to Grails 4 is nothing like the upgrade from Grails 2 to Grails 3, all right? If you started back in the Grails 2 days and you've upgraded applications, then you know that the entire build system was replaced, the entire plugin system was changed drastically. So there was a lot of really breaking changes between Grails 2 and Grails 3, and that's not the case with Grails 3 to Grails 4. Most of the people that have done some early testing with Grails 4 said that it was a relatively painless upgrade. So what are some of these, what are some of the potential challenges of upgrading your application? Most, if not all, of the deprecated code that's been deprecated in Grails 3 has been removed. We have repackaged or restructured some of our packages to better support the Java 9 module system. But other than that, there's no major breaking API changes. So there's no, nothing that you're currently using today has broken in any sort of major way. So everything that, unless it was deprecated, as I just said. And most plugins that you're using should just work. The only sort of difference is if they're using some sort of API that has been changed or was removed, right? So there's no sort of breaking change in the way that plugins are written or read or anything like that. But there are breaking changes in Spring, Hibernate, and Groovy. So part of the issue with talking about upgrading to Grails 4 is that you're really talking about upgrading to a bunch of other underlying technologies, right? You're not just talking about our APIs. And so when you're doing the upgrade, you have to sort of keep all of these, you have to understand all of the different changes that have been made to all these underlying projects. And so one of them is Spring Boot, right? Which is sort of the biggest piece of it. And there's been a bunch of changes in Spring Boot. One of them is configuration changes. So a lot of configuration related to the embedded server is changed. There's been, just the configuration properties themselves, and as well as the APIs to dealing with embedded containers. So if you had any sort of plugin or your application is modifying the embedded container, likely you'll have to change some of that code. And also endpoints. So they revamped a lot of the code surrounding endpoints, which allowed them to add some new features to them, and also changes the way that they're configured. So if you're using Spring Boot endpoints and you're configuring them, then likely you'll need to make some changes there in order to continue. Spring changes. So Grails 3 uses Spring 4.3, Grails 4 uses Spring 5. You can take a look at this migration guide that's out there, but there's, as far as the average Grails application, I don't see anything in there that would likely impact folks. If you're doing some things that are very Spring specific, then you may have some issues. So I would just encourage you to read that guide and make sure none of that applies to your application. So there are some changes around GORM and Hibernate. So one of the biggest changes around Hibernate is that Hibernate now requires a transaction for all operations, right? Which includes reads. So it was very common in Grails applications to perhaps do some light domain access in a controller, where there was no transactional annotation on the controller. And now the case is that you must have a transaction, especially for writes. And so depending on how you've architected your application, if you've sort of done the standard path of moving all of your domain logic into services, which are transactional by default when you create them, like with a create service command, then you likely won't have any issue. But if you're doing some other things like where that's not the case, then you'll definitely have a problem. You'll need to apply those transactional annotations where they need to be. And proxy behavior has changed. So previously, and I have another slide about this, we'll talk about the proxy behavior a little bit more in depth. But in general, GORM used to unwrap proxies for a has one sort of association, and that's no longer the case. And in addition, there's no more REST client that ships with GORM 7. So there's a Grails data store REST client that was a part of GORM 6.1, and that's no longer shipped with GORM 7. So we recommend folks to switch away from that client and instead use our MicroNot HTTP client. But you can also go back and add the dependency to the GORM 6.1 version, and that should work okay too. So about the proxy changes is that in this example, we have a domain class called book, which has an author, which is also a domain. And in previous versions of GORM, the .author portion of, after book.get would cause the author to be, would cause the author to be unwrapped, the proxy, and it would cause the database, a database query to be fired off to retrieve that author, right? When it's quite possible that that's not necessary. So if you were just passing that author to say some other domain.find by author, then it would result in an extra database call that was not necessary. So so it was changed that the proxy would not be unwrapped, right? So So if you attempted to retrieve any of those properties on the author, then that would obviously cause the query to occur. Just like it did in Grails 3. But it has some subtle impacts for things like inheritance. So the proxy is of type author. So if you had subclasses of author, then and you wanted to check to see if this instance is an instance of one of those subclasses, then that will always return false, because the proxy is always of the type that's specified in the domain class. So so that could be a little bit tricky to sort of understand, and that could be a surprising change, that if you upgrade your application and certain things aren't working, that could be the cause. So we have, along with Grails 4, we also have this upgrade to Groovy 2.5. So there is no more, there's some breaking changes in Groovy 2.5, but there's not a lot, because a lot of the regressions and things like that that were introduced with 2.5 have been resolved, because I think we're up to 2.5.6 now. But one of the things is that there's no more all jar. So Groovy used to produce like a Groovy-all dependency, which would include the whole kitchen sink of Groovy dependencies. And that caused a whole bunch of different problems, because if you had one application that was depending on the specific libraries that it needed, and you have another library that depended on an all jar of a different version, then there would be conflicts. So they stopped producing this all jar, but it's still possible to sort of retrieve everything through the Groovy POM, right? They specify an all classifier. There's some new annotations in Groovy that you should check out. So you can check that link there. And things like @map constructor and auto final, and there's a whole bunch of new nice annotations that you can take advantage of in Groovy. One of the things that you might get tripped up on is that if you're using any of the extensions on the date class, so like date +1, which would add 1 day, that's now in a separate dependency that's not included by default. So you just have to add the dependency to Groovy date utils, and then that will just continue to work as you expect. And also if you want to upgrade your version of the JDK, so if you're using Java 8 and you want to use Java 11, you can, right? So Java 8, 9, 10, and 11 are supported in Grails 4. However, just understand that you're going to get some warnings saying that there's some unsafe access with reflection, right? So so there's really nothing that can be done about that at this point. When Groovy 3 gets released at some point, then apparently those warnings will no longer be present. But that's just sort of the way it is for right now. So plugins. So plugins should mostly just work, right? If you have a Grails 3 plugin, there's a pretty good chance that it will just continue on working in a Grails 4 application. There's not that many cases where plugins should be breaking, but if they're using an API that's been changed or removed, then obviously that's possible. I think maybe a couple more common cases will be the Grails domain class API, and also the Spring Boot embedded server API. So previously, Grails had its own notion of your domain classes, where it mapped all the different properties and associations as part of the Grails domain class API. And then also Gorm was doing the same work, right? So Gorm was also taking a look at all of your domain classes and mapping it, and it has its own API called the Persistent Entity API, right? And so in Grails 3 applications, in later versions of Grails 3, I think it was 3.3, we changed it so that the Grails domain class API simply delegates to the Persistent Entity API, so that work of parsing your domain classes only happens once. And then in Grails 4, we've removed the Grails domain class API entirely. So if you have a later version of Grails 3, I can't remember if it was 3.2 or 3.3, then this likely won't affect you if the plugins you're using weren't using deprecated APIs. But if they were, then that's possible that could have an impact on upgrading your applications. And the only solution there is to just rewrite those API, that code to use in your API. Gradle changes. So in Grails 3, we supported all new applications. All new applications were created with Gradle 3, right? But we supported Gradle 4. So when Gradle 4 came out, they introduced some breaking changes, and we made changes in our plugins to support both versions, right? Which was sort of an issue for us because we weren't really testing with Gradle 4 internally. We were just using Gradle 3, right?
Hey, James, can you hear me?
Yes.
There is a question in the Q&A. Is Grails domain class mapping context also affected?
No, because I think that was always pointing to the persistent, the normal mapping context. The mapping context was not changed. Yeah, so as far as Gradle, there's been breaking changes between 3 to 4 and also 4 to 5. So depending on your build, right? If you just have a normal build with just, some dependencies and that kind of stuff, then defining your repositories and some plugins, then you're probably not going to have any major issues. But if you're doing a whole lot of custom things in your build, then it's possible that you might need to change some of it. And depending on what version you're coming from, right? If you're coming from Grails, an earlier version of Grails 3, you're probably using Gradle 3. And if you're going to upgrade to Grails 4, then it's going to be Gradle 5. So that's a possible point of contention with upgrading. But if you just have a kind of standard build, then it's likely not going to be a problem. All right, so now we'll move on to the MicroNot integration. So for those who are not familiar with MicroNot at all, MicroNot is it's a foundational library. That's what we're calling it, a foundational library for building applications on the JVM, right? MicroNot supports sort of the standard web application. It also supports things like CLI-based applications or functions that you can deploy to AWS Lambda, and supports a whole wide array of use cases. And the focus of MicroNot is primarily around building microservices, right? But it has plenty of use outside of that use case as well. And the main focus of MicroNot is to provide you with a framework that has a small memory footprint with very good performance, right? So we're talking about startup time, we're talking about memory consumption, and we're also talking about time to serve requests, right? And all of that is achieved through the elimination of reflection, runtime proxies, and runtime analysis of your code. So MicroNot does almost everything at compile time that can be done at compile time, right? So, so when you compile your application with MicroNot, some additional things get compiled, additional classes get created, and we use those classes to create your beans and all those things. And one of the major differences, because Grails does a lot of compile time things as well, right? So Gorm data services are also compile time, and there's a lot of compile time enhancements in Grails itself. But the main difference is that MicroNot does not touch or modify your classes at all, and whereas Grails does, right? And Grails requires Groovy, but MicroNot can be used with Java, Groovy, or Kotlin. So when we talk about the integration between these two sort of frameworks, it's important to understand what pieces are used from which, right? So Grails 4 is still using the servlet API, right, where MicroNot does not. Micronaut server, its runtime is based off of Netty. And so there's no servlet API in there at all. And so we're not using the Micronaut HTTP server at all in a Grails 4 application. So what that means is that most of the features that are surrounding the server of Micronaut will not apply in a Grails 4 app. We're going to be converting many of the Grails, any Grails plugins or internal components that we use. We're going to be converting those to Micronaut over time. And the idea there is to improve the performance of your Grails applications. So the more of the beans that get created with Micronaut, then the faster your application will be, basically. And there are many existing features out there in Micronaut that you can use today in your Grails 4 app. So a lot of those a couple of those are the Kafka integration, the RabbitMQ integration, which is great, our HTTP client, and any data store configurations, basically any feature that does not rely on the HTTP server. So, when you're talking about Micronaut or Grails, should I be creating, if I want to create like a plugin for Grails, should I be creating a plugin, or should I be creating a Micronaut configuration, right? Because that's what Micronaut uses, or we call them configurations, which they sort of work like plugins, but it's just a little bit different. So should I be creating a configuration or a plugin? Well, we say that unless you have a reason why you need to create a plugin, that you should create a configuration instead. And the reason why is because it will work with, it has the potential to work with Spring, Grails, and also Micronaut applications, right? So it's just a bonus. It works with everything, right? And there's a library that you can use called, it's a Micronaut-Spring, which allows you to essentially write a configuration with Spring annotations, and Micronaut will still compile all of the data at compile time so that it will also work with Micronaut, right? So we would encourage you to build configurations instead of plugins, because plugins only work with Grails, whereas configurations can work with Grails, regular Spring apps, and also Micronaut. So you can have the singular code base, and then if you have some Grails apps and some Micronaut apps, you can use it in both, right? Which is great. And then also there's some things that are only possible with plugins currently. One of them is like views, like if you have like GSPs in your plugin, Micronaut doesn't support GSPs, so you couldn't have those. Same thing with like tag libs or JSON views, right? So there are some things that can only really live in a plugin, but most things can be just a regular Micronaut configuration. So why Micronaut? Why do we decide to introduce Micronaut into Grails, right? And the biggest benefits are performance, right? We're talking about no reflection, no runtime proxies, no runtime, bytecode generation or reading, and eliminating all these things leads to reduced memory consumption and faster startup time, which really leads to cheaper costs for cloud providers, right? The less memory you use, the less you pay. Yeah. So especially the startup time is increasingly important for things like serverless functions, for the Internet of Things, and microservices that you may need to spin up and shut down quickly. So let's talk a little bit about Micronaut configurations, right? These are some of the things that you may want that you are currently doing with plugins. You would say, well, how do I do that with the Micronaut configuration? Well, a lot of times plugins can provide they provide configuration, right? You can have like a plugin.yaml, and then that configuration will be passed down to the application that depends on the plugin. And Micronaut does not support that, but it supports it in a slightly different way with an act configuration properties class. In Grails, you would specify a your plugin.groovy class where you would define your beans, right, in the do with application context, or do with Spring method, maybe I forget what it's called. And in Micronaut, you do things a little bit differently with classes that are annotated with that singleton or factory classes. And in Grails plugins, you could have logic where you're defining these beans and say, only load this bean if this configuration is present, right? So the bean, whether it overrides or not, is conditional. And we have an at requires annotation that does a similar sort of behavior. And then also at replaces. So one of the biggest differences between the Spring context and the Micronaut context is that for every, all the Spring beans are named, right? And you usually, the practice is to override them based off of their name. So if you want to override something in, Spring Security Core, you would create a bean with the same name as what it's named in Spring Security Core. And in Micronaut, there are no, in the Micronaut context itself, there are no bean names, and you replace things based off of the type, yeah? So here's, just a little sample code of a configuration properties class, where we are supplying a class that's going to be bound from configuration. So this class example configuration will be a bean, right? And that bean, you could retrieve it from the context and then retrieve that name property from it, right? And if the configuration key is not specified at all, then the default value that you assign to that field there will be used, right? So you can supply default configuration simply by setting defaults on the properties in your configuration class. And then if anybody overrides them, they just simply override them, and that's that. So this is a way that you can get some default configuration, supply default configuration, and also allow users to override that configuration themselves, right? Conditional beans. So this, you can see in this example, we have this default example bean, and it's a singleton, right? Because it's annotated with that singleton. So we don't need to sort of register this in a plugin class. You just say add singleton, and that's all there is to it. One thing to keep in mind is that this is looking for the Java X inject singleton, right? There's a Groovy annotation also called singleton, which gets imported sort of by default unless you explicitly say so. So for your Groovy code, make sure you're importing the right annotation there. And then you can specify one or many of these at requires annotations. And there's a whole bunch of possibilities that you can do here. There's, you can detect, say this bean should only be loaded if there's a class that is available or isn't available, if another bean is available. If there's configuration properties, and you can expect, that this configuration property will be set to this value, right? And you can also specify a custom condition where you can write a class that will essentially evaluate the condition with your custom code, right? So if it needs to be more complex. So there's a whole bunch of different options there that you can do to say this bean should be conditionally loaded based off of whatever criteria you want to specify. Overriding beans, right? So in this case, we say at replaces. Replaces is the annotation that says this bean is going to replace another bean, and you just specify the type of the bean that you want to replace. And so the types must match. And if you want to have some beans in your application that cannot be replaced, right? Let's say you're creating a configuration, and this is sort of something that should just always be the case. You can annotate it with that infrastructure, and then that bean will no longer be replaceable. Okay. One of the, I think, which is, I gave a talk about the MicroNot HTTP client, for an hour recently at the DevNexus conference in Atlanta. And so, I could talk about the HTTP client for an hour quite easily. But so this is one of the great features of MicroNot that really shows off the elegance and the beauty of the framework, in my opinion. So you can simply annotate an interface with @client and specify sort of a base URL, and then any interface methods that are supplied there that are put in the interface will be implemented for you. Right, so simply just by retrieving a bean of type GitHub client and calling get in the get info method will make the HTTP request, parse the response, and send it back to you, right? So in this case, we have sort of like an info class, so we're likely using JSON serialization here. And all of that happens behind the scenes. If you want to add headers, you can do so, just add header annotation. Headers can be put on arguments to the interface methods, and the the URL string can have variables in it. So if you want to put the variable in the URL, just like how we are here with Slug, you can do that. There's really sort of any sort of option that you can imagine of doing with an HTTP client can be done through this declarative style. Yeah, and by default. Everything sort of reactive is supported. Excuse me. So if you want to return a completable future of an info, you can do that, right? If you want to return a RX Java flowable or a single, you can do that as well. So all those sort of reactive or asynchronous return types are supported in the HTTP client. And all of that is done without any sort of reflection or runtime proxies, right? So all the proxy classes are generated at compile time. MicroNot messaging. So MicroNot supports just purely message-driven applications, right? So if you were to just create a regular MicroNot application, for example, with the Kafka profile, there would be no HTTP server involved there at all. It would simply just be a message, listener and producer. And you can use those features in your Grails application as well, right? So you can, just like how I showed there with @client, you can say @RabbitListener, and then that will listen for messages on RabbitMQ, right? You can say, @RabbitClient, and then that will produce messages, that will send messages to RabbitMQ, right? So you can just supply a little bit of configuration and then supply an interface for producing messages or a regular class for listening to messages, and you're off to the races. You really don't need to be experienced with the RabbitMQ Java client API yourself. And a similar thing goes for Kafka, right? And so we plan on implementing this similar level of support for other messaging systems in the future. I know, JMS is on our radar for those folks that are still using that. But currently we have RabbitMQ and Kafka support. So to sort of summarize all this up, upgrading is very different compared to 2 to 3. There's no, it's not a major shift in the underlying technologies of the framework. We're really mostly just upgrading the versions and keeping everything up to date so that you can use the latest versions of Java. And MicroNot provides an awesome foundation to be able to improve both Grails and MicroNot in the future, because any sort of, most of the things that we implement with MicroNot will also now be available with Grails, right? So if we implement JMS support, then JMS support will then be added to Grails just by default. MicroNot provides those building blocks to create libraries, configurations, all those things. So you can create libraries that work with Grails, Spring, and MicroNot. And we say, build those MicroNot configurations or libraries and try not to build plugins when you don't have to, yeah? And so I'll open it up for questions.
James, we've got a couple of outstanding questions in the chat windows. One is, let's see, one just now popped up. Can we generate domain persistence in Grails if we use MicroNot, or is this limited to GORM only? So of course it's not limited to GORM only, but you want to speak to that?
Can we generate the domain persistence in Grails if we use MicroNot? So I'm not sure I understand the question. So GORM works in both. GORM works in both Grails and MicroNot, right? So the functionality is the same no matter where you use it. But if you're talking about domain persistence, I mean, you could use straight up Hibernate. You could use basically anything you like, whether in Grails or MicroNot. There's really nothing in either of those things precludes you from doing what you'd like.
Absolutely. Definitely not limited to GORM only, but GORM is the default, or until most folks will use in a Grails app.
Right.
So when I create a class annotated with app component, Grails 4 will use MicroNot IOC instead of Spring IOC ?
So no. If you annotate a class with that component and the Micronaut Spring library is present, then it will, right? So it requires an extra library of just of Micronaut-Spring. So the Micronaut Spring library is mainly just used for when you're creating like a library or a plugin, right? So it's if you're talking about your own application, you can simply use at factory, or you could use the Micronaut what Micronaut supports directly if that's what you'd like to do.
Right. So is there a release date estimation? Presumably they're talking about Grails 4 GA.
Yeah. So I don't think we have an estimate. I mean, I think definitely we're looking in the next Q2 or Q3, I would imagine. But I don't think we have sort of a. It's really just based off of the feedback that we get. So if people are trying out a milestone 2 and it looks really good and there's no major issues, then we'll release an RC. And then if that trend continues of no major issues, then we'll release a GA shortly thereafter. If there's something that comes up that surprises us, then or if Groovy 3 gets released tomorrow, then that might change things. But otherwise, I think it's Q2.
Yep, I think Q2 is more likely than Q3, but as James says, it'll depend a lot on feedback from the community based on the milestones and the RCs. I know he was only kidding, but just to be clear, Groovy 3 is not going to be released tomorrow. Groovy 3 might be released this year, might not. There's no danger that it's going to show up in the next few weeks.
Right.
So just to be clear to folks who might not necessarily be tuned into those channels. So MicroNot can be run on Grail VM. Can a Grails 4 app use Grail VM?
The answer is it possibly technically could, but I don't think that will be an easy road for you. We've done a lot of work in MicroNot to allow it to work with Grail VM, and most of that work surrounds the removal of reflection. And it's quite common for Grails apps to use a whole lot of reflection. So while I think it's possible, I don't think that that's feasible without a whole lot of work, basically.
Right. So which version of MicroNot will Grails 4 work with?
Grails 4, I think right now is using the release candidate of MicroNot 1.1. So I think the goal will be to when Grails 4 gets released, it will work. It will be set up by default to use MicroNot 1.1.
Right. Did you compare the startup time to Grails 3? The startup time of Grails 3 to Grails 4 in a non-Hello World app?
Yeah. So the only thing I can tell you there is what I've seen and what others have said. Right. So it's going to be dependent completely on your application. So there's no you're going to see a 50% improvement. I can't tell you that. All that I can tell you is that most of the folks that I've spoken to about it that have tried it said there was a significant improvement, right? Not 5%, but but not 50 either. Right?
Yeah, and a point to keep in mind is, so we've refactored a good bit of the internals of Grails to use MicroNot instead of Spring, and that's where a lot of the startup time for an empty app or otherwise is coming from. And the difference is considerable. So for just a newly created Grails Create app, what are the ballpark numbers you're seeing for startup time for 3 and 4, James?
Did you compare startup? I'm sorry, what did you say, Jeff? I missed it.
So if you just Grails Create app, a Grails 3 app and a Grails 4 app and start them, just ballpark numbers on your hardware, what kind of startup times do you generally see?
Yeah, so in Grails 4, I think I'm seeing like it's like 6 seconds, and it's been a while since I've measured that in Grails 3 actually, so I'm not quite sure.
It's not 6 seconds, so it might be more like 20 or 30 or something like that. Maybe 30 is long, but it's not going to be 6, 7, 8, 9 seconds. And just to be clear, so talking about an empty application like that is useful, but it's not the case that these startup improvements only apply in an empty app. It's just not the case. All right, let's see. Can you talk a bit more about how Spring and MicroNot sit together and interact? Grails will still have a Spring context, and then MicroNot components will be used for integrations, ?
Yeah, so basically Spring allows for a parent context, right? So what we've done is when you start a Grails 4 application, it's starting up the normal Spring application context, right? As it always has. But then in addition, it's also spinning up a MicroNot application context. And then we have a sort of a bridge API that takes where we're bridging the MicroNot application context and fitting it into the API of the Spring application context, right? And then we're telling Spring that to use this context as the parent. And what that means in general is that you can look in this context for beans, right? So if you inject a bean and it can't find it in the Spring context, it will look for it in the MicroNot context.
Right. I hope that addresses the question. Any support for AWS? Kinesis is coming soon. Kinesis.
Not that I'm aware of. If that's something that you would like, you can file an issue and we'll take a look at it.
Let's see. Are you planning to publish some benchmark stress tests, configuration examples, and throughputs, answer times, etc. for Grails 4?
Not specifically. Is there anything else you want to add on to that?
Yep. So I can add a couple of comments to that. So we are working on some call them benchmarks, but some things that we're going to publish soon, hopefully in Q2, that will relate MicroNot to some other technologies in the space, in particular Spring Boot. And what we're working on and building and will be delivering is executable code projects that you'll be able to look at yourself. You'll be able to run and verify how these things relate to each other. So some of the easiest things to look at will be things like how long does it take to start the process? How much memory does the thing take? How long does it take to service requests? All that kind of stuff. But rather than us just publish a report that says, hey, MicroNot is better in XYZ ways, we're going to do that, but provide these sample apps that support those claims. One of the things that we're looking at now is how to figure Grails 4 into that. So it may be the case that what we'll do is we'll end up with implementations of these projects in MicroNot and Boot and Grails 4. Some of that is still TBD. We're still in the process of laying all that out and starting to build it. But we'll be putting everything together that we can to help folks understand how all these technologies relate to each other in terms of performance, but as well as in other terms like code simplicity, integrations with popular systems, integrations with cloud platforms. It's not all about performance, but performance is one of the certainly one piece of that. So look for more to come along those lines in the coming quarter or so. We're actively working on a lot of that. Right. Let's see. What are the risks of using current milestone in production? Okay. Do you want to talk about that, James?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, so the risk is that something will not work correctly and you'll have a bug, right? So I would definitely not recommend putting it into production until you've made sure that that everything works as you expect, right? So I think that basically sums it up, yeah.
Yeah, a milestone is really sort of a snapshot in time. Where are we at today? What does the code look like? And generally, it'll be reliable and work. But most often, folks are not going to want to put, not going to want to rely on a milestone release of technology to put in production. But as James said, if you do your validation and everything works and does what you want it to do, and there's no reason you can't go to production with a milestone release. But be careful about doing that. And we're not that far away from GA. But be careful about using milestones of anything in production. Just validate that it does what you need it to do. All right, when do you recommend the point between building a Grails 4 REST versus a MicroNot service with a standalone front end? Yeah, so that's the question.
Yeah, so so really it boils down to what's important to you. So if you have a whole bunch of libraries, a whole bunch of things that are Spring based, right? If you're in a heavy Spring ecosystem, if you're using Spring Cloud and you're using all of those things and or other Spring related libraries, then it may not be worth it to switch to Micronaut for a REST application. And especially if it's something that doesn't have a lot of load, it doesn't have a lot of users, and the startup time really isn't that important to you, then you can continue on using Grails and you'll be very happy. If this is something where maybe it's greenfield technology where you haven't it's you're starting something new and you're not upgrading something, then for simple, not simple, but for mostly, JSON responses back and forth without a heavy view layer, then we would recommend that you use MicroNot.
Right. So when do we anticipate MicroNot 1.1.0 RC2 to ship? Wait a minute. It says 1.1.0 RC2. Yeah.
So is that so RC1 created projects don't resolve with Gradle?
Yep.
So if RC1 projects don't resolve with Gradle, then definitely report that issue, because I don't think we're aware of that. But we just released RC1 not that long ago, so we'll release RC2 based on feedback. It seems as of right now, feedback's good. There may not be an RC2. We may simply just release after this RC.
Yeah. Can you speak a bit about the hot reloading changes in Grails 4?
Yeah. So Spring Loaded is out. The Spring Loaded does not work with later versions of Java, and was also a large sort of pain point for a lot of people. Even though when it did work, it worked really well and it was nice. So we're now using the standard solution that comes with Spring Boot apps, which is called Spring Boot DevTools, and that works a little bit differently in that it sort of does a hot reload of your application, which will in fact restart the server. So it works differently, but it also works a little bit better in that it will accept more changes, right? So Spring Loaded previously was relatively picky on what changes it would handle and would not handle. Whereas Spring Boot DevTools will actually handle a more wide array of changes. But instead of just, reloading that one class or whatever, it sort of restarts the server, right? So that can have impacts if you have like an in-memory database, right? And you make some changes to some controllers, then you're gonna lose those in-memory changes, right? So it works a little bit differently, but in general, it's a similar sort of user experience.
Right. Application YAML or other configuration build.gradle remains the same in Grails 4? Question mark.
Yes.
Right. How is Mongo support better in GORM 7?
As far as I understand, there's really no changes, perhaps except for updating of the driver to a newer version. There's really not many changes there.
Yeah, I don't think there are any significant new capabilities there. Any pointers, documentation for creating configuration libraries with MicroNot?
Yeah, so if you go to docs.micronaut.io, there's a relatively large user guide that talks all about MicroNot. There's a section on the inversion of control container, right, which talks about configuration properties and all of those things. So just check that out and go from there. So it's really just a MicroNot configuration. There's a whole bunch of examples out there too, right? So if you want to look at any of the repositories under micronaut-github.com/micronaut-projects, you can see a whole bunch of examples there and how we do that.
Right. So Grails console fails to load Groovy files in Grails 3. Is this fixed in Grails 4? So I'm not sure what fails to load there, but in general, the Grails console definitely works in Grails 3. Do you know anything about Groovy files not loading in the Grails console, James?
Nope, that would be new to me.
That'd be new to me. There must be more to it than that. It's definitely not the case that the Grails console won't load Groovy files. So Jim, if you can provide any more information around that, if it looks like a bug, definitely file a bug report or reach out to us one way or the other and just let us know whatever that's about. But so I'm not sure what the problem is you're referencing. But we're happy to help. So definitely let us know if you want to follow up on that. Let's see. Cause of the Hibernate related changes, do you know if I could use Hibernate Inverse plugin with Grails 4?
I don't know that for a fact, but I don't have any reason to believe that you can't, as long as it supports the later versions of Hibernate, right? So I haven't looked into the Hibernate Inverse plugin myself, so it's quite possible that it needs to be upgraded to work with a newer version of Hibernate. But it's also possible that it will work. So I don't really know.
Yeah. Is the MicroNot GraphQL module supported in Grails 4 projects?
So the MicroNot GraphQL module is designed to work with with the MicroNot HTTP server, right? So in general, no. But however, there's a GORM GraphQL module which provides that web layer that you're looking for. It's a Grails plugin that will provide the web layer that the MicroNot GraphQL module does.
Right. So GraphQL is supported, but not by way of the MicroNot GraphQL module that the asker mentioned.
Correct. Yep.
Let's see, for plugins that do have a view layer, would the recommendation be to factor out the non-view layer stuff into a configuration and have just the view related code in a plugin and have a transitive dependency on the configuration from plugin?
So I think that wholly depends on how complicated the non-view layer part is and how complicated the view layer part is, right? I think that's just a distinction that you would have to make when you're writing it, right? Whether it's worth it to do that or not. So I don't think there's any, one answer to that question.
Right. What's over here? Is JMS support plan for MicroNot 1.1?
No. No, it could be 1.2 or perhaps after that, but no, definitely not 1.1.
Someone says the GORM 7 is not yet documented. Is GORM 7 not yet documented because Grails 4 is not yet released? I'm a little bit surprised that the GORM 7 docs are not out there. Are the GORM 7 docs out there? The snapshot docs?
Yeah, they're definitely out there. You're probably just, by default, we don't show snapshot documentation by default.
Let me I'll put a link here in the, is that right? I think that's right. Yeah, here it is. Just
to ask about runtime.groovy, and there's no changes for that.
Yeah. There we go. For the GORM 7 documentation, there's a link I'm posting as a response to the question there. Is RxGorm REST client also deprecated?
That's a good question. So RxGorm in general hasn't seen much love over the years. I'm not sure if it would be considered deprecated or not at this point. Any information on that, Jeff?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Is it a good idea to use React or Vue.js and then use Micronaut in the back end? Would that be a good replacement for Grails? So those are two separate questions. The answer to the first one is yes, and the answer to the second one is depends, right? But do you want to speak to that, James?
Yeah, so I mean, so it really gets back to the earlier question about, what if my app is just serving JSON and I have a React front end, and you can do that in Grails and that's fine. So really it just depends on, the features that you want and the libraries that you use, right? If you're dependent on a lot of Spring libraries, then it's probably best to stay with those, because otherwise you'd have to find replacements for them. And those may not exist, right? So it could be a great effort to switch from Grails to Micronaut in those cases. But if you're talking about something that's new, then and you're just serving JSON back and forth, then Micronaut is probably the better fit for that use case.
Agreed. Will deployment of functions to AWS Lambda be supported in Grails 4 like it is in Micronaut?
You could deploy Grails 4 applications like you can to Lambda, but I think it's a similar case as if you did it with Spring Boot, right? So, so it's not going to have the performance as if it was just a straight up Micronaut application being deployed to Lambda, right? Because Grails 4 is still using Spring, and Spring still has all of those inherent limitations, by using reflection and runtime proxies. So, so it's I mean, you could do it today. You could put a Grails application in Lambda, but it's not going to have sub-second startup times, right?
Yep. So Micronaut's going to be a much better fit for that in particular.
Right.
Where'd it go? They're scrolling by so quick. There we go. Will Spring Security and Spring Security REST work the same? Presumably they mean the same in 4 as it does in 3.
Yes.
Right. Jeff, how would you limit the fields in the POJO given you can't annotate with JSON view? What are we talking about there? How would you limit the fields in the POJO given you can't annotate with JSON view? I'm not sure how to make sense of that question.
Yeah, I would need more information in order to answer that.
All right. This is a cue for OCI. With Gradle gravitating towards Kotlin DSL, is Groovy losing steam and hence OCI is going to less supportive of Grails? So there are several things there. Definitely OCI is not less supportive of Grails. If anything, it's going in the other direction. We're investing heavily in Grails. There's definitely no concern about that. Is Gradle gravitating towards Kotlin DSL? What does that have to do with Groovy losing steam? So that process started a couple of years ago, or has it been that long? It's been quite a while. So there are reasons that the Kotlin DSL makes sense in the context of Gradle in particular, at least for some things, and that has practically no impact on how we leverage Groovy inside of the Grails framework. But maybe the significant part of that question is, does that mean anything about OCI being less supportive of Grails? And as I said, absolutely not. We're increasing our investment in Grails. And Grails 4 is a good example of that. A new version of Gorm and Hibernate database migration plugin will work the same, question mark.
Yep, as far as I know, it'll work the same.
Yep. Comment on the backend question. I think Grails with JSON views is perfect as a backend to SPA clients. I agree that it's a great fit. So that's not really a question. Let's see. Is there any plans to fully support Kotlin or Java in Grails?
No.
Yeah.
There's not. Yeah. The AST transformations, which is what Grails is based off of, are wholly reliant on Groovy code. So when you're talking about artifacts and beans and things like that, with just straight up like in Grails 3, That's not going to work. Now, if you were to create beans in Kotlin or Java and simply use the MicroNot annotations, then I think that would work, assuming that you have the dependencies set up correctly.
I just accidentally clicked respond to a question before I was done typing. There's a question that says, earlier it was suggested that you could upgrade directly from Grails 2 to Grails 4. So not only was it suggested, absolutely you can do that. You could pretend Grails 3 doesn't even exist, and you could update a Grails 2 application to Grails 4. No question about that. When can we expect documentation for that? Currently, documentation only describes going from 3.3 to 4. I don't know that we'll invest a whole lot of effort into documenting how to upgrade Grails 2 applications to Grails 4. You have anything to say about that, James?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, that's just not feasible to write documentation from any one version to any one version. Release Grails 5, then it's an end problem at that point. Right? Yep. So yeah, so I think the best thing to do would simply to read and understand the changes as they've come across, and that's sort of the cost of not upgrading over the last 3 or 4 years, right?
Agreed. So a comment on the back end question. I think that's already we already addressed that. Sorry about that. What is the IntelliJ support for Grails 4? Any interesting additions in IntelliJ?
No, I think it works exactly the same as it does in Grails 3.
Agreed. Agreed. Let's see. Well, we addressed the JMS question already. Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
So I think that's all of the outstanding questions in the Q&A and in the chat panel. We'll keep things live here for a few minutes. So if you've got a question that has not been addressed, or just have a new question you haven't asked yet, but please let us know either through the Q&A panel there or the chat window, and we'll be happy to address whatever we can. Yeah. Anything you want to put on the table for discussion before we wrap it up here, James?
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is, give the latest milestone a try, and any feedback that we can get right now is incredibly important.
That's absolutely the case. So folks, experimenting with the milestones and then eventually the RCs, all that feedback is really, really valuable. It's the whole reason that we have that process in place. Well, whatever feedback you can provide on the milestones or RCs, and of course this applies to Grails 4 as well as MicroNot 1.1. Let us know what doesn't work. Let us know any ideas that you have for how to improve things. That community feedback is absolutely vital and has been a tremendous factor in the success of Grails over the years and the success of MicroNot so far. And that is feedback from the community, people building real apps with the stuff and letting us know what works well and letting us know what ideas you've got to improve things. All that is tremendously valuable. So we appreciate all of that feedback. Is Grails development secured for the next 3 to 4 years with object computing? The history was sometimes not so secure. So we started Grails about 12 years ago, and we've been working on it nonstop that whole time. There's never been an interruption. So the comment there may be referencing when we left Pivotal. But when we left Pivotal, we picked up immediately after we left Pivotal. So the last day of March was my last day at Pivotal. And a couple weeks later was my first day at OCI. So that's probably the biggest gap there's been over the 12 years. So I don't know of any time in the history of Grails where things were not secure. So I have no concerns about that. Will MicroNot ever support GSP views?
No. There's no planned support for GSPs in MicroNot.
Yep. I would stop just short of saying never, but there's no plan to do that right now. In principle, it could be done, but not something that we're planning to do right now. Let's see. Thanks, great. Thank you. How do we limit? Yeah. So no outstanding questions. We'll give it just another minute. But what is the best way to get feedback on Grails 4 issues? So if you go to our GitHub repository, and I'll really quickly here, I'll have a link for you. but our issue tracker is the best way to provide feedback on things like bugs, feature requests, that sort of thing. If you want to, for other kinds of feedback, like for things that are more discussion related, instead of filing an issue in our GitHub repo, if you join the community Slack channel, that's a great place to just interact with the community and the core OCI team to discuss whatever it is that you want to discuss around Grails. And for MicroNot, when we set up the MicroNot channel, we set it up in Gitter instead of Slack. So that happened about a year ago, and we've been really happy with that. I just saw a question scroll by. It already left my screen, but there was something about, can we please move the Grails chat to Gitter? It's something that we've talked about. I don't know if we'll do that or not. Personally, I think it would be a good idea. I'd like to. Really, a big thing that caused us to use Gitter for the MicroNot community and not Slack is the history retention. So in Slack, Slack doesn't maintain history, so you can't go back and search archives. In order to get Slack to maintain history, you have to have paid accounts, and we looked into that, and because of the size of the community, it was going to cost a couple $100,000 a year to support that, and that really wasn't a realistic consideration. So we'll see. We may move the Grails community to Slack. We may move the Grails community to Gitter at some point. It's good feedback that at least one person thinks that would be a good idea. But I wouldn't rule it out. You have anything to say about that, James?
Yeah. I just it's a major sort of ask of all the people that have signed up and are participating to move to Gitter. So there's a lot of times companies have different policies on what chat things they support, right? So some companies will block Gitter and some will allow Slack and vice versa, right? So I think there's probably just not enough good reasons to at least make us change in the short term, but perhaps at some point in the future.
What is the recommendation if we use instance of in our GORM objects today?
Yeah, so in that slide, it really only affects when you have a sort of 2-1 relationship that has a parent-child, right? So it's if there's inheritance in that relationship, right? So the proxy will always be of whatever type is defined in the domain class. So if something extended author and you want to do an is instance of, in order to truly understand what instance it is, then you need to unwrap the proxy, right? And so you can inject like a proxy handler and call unwrap, pass it to the unwrap method, and then that will execute the database call and return the real instance, yeah.
Well, I wanted to just interject here quickly. I know that I wanted to be conscious of everybody's time. So it is about 11:15. So we can hang on for a little bit longer to answer some more questions live. But I wanted to just thank James for delivering the webinar today, and Jeff also for being online here with us today to answer questions. This has been a wonderful session. We have had a wonderful audience. So thank you again. And we really appreciate the enthusiasm and the interest in Grails 4. We are so excited about it. Like I said before, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar today. And like James and Jeff both said, please do send your feedback in, and they provided the links to that. We will also provide the links in the email that we send to you. And we would love to come and talk to your team or any meetup nearby and talk to you about Grails 4 or MicroNot. So please do reach out to us and let us know, because we'd love to come and talk more about it. So thanks again. And like I said, we'll hang on here for probably another 5-10 minutes or so and continue to answer questions.
There is a question. Any upgrade to the async framework in Grails 4, James?
No changes there. I think it was split off Grails async, I think, is its own library now, but there hasn't been any changes.
Yeah. I agree with what Jen said. This is it's really fantastic to see all the enthusiasm from the community. I see lots of folks are signing off now as we're over time. So I think we should wrap it up. Definitely reach out to us and let us know whatever we can do to help you. And that can be just simple tech questions. If you need help at a larger scale, of course, OCI is here to help folks be successful with our technology, and whatever we can do to help folks with that, we want to do that. So please reach out and just let us know whatever it is you'd like to share, if that's a request or feedback, whatever it is, we'd love to hear from you. And I think we can probably wrap it up for now. James, any last thing from you?
No.
Very good. All right. Thank you everyone who's still here. Thank you for attending, and best of luck with Grails 4, and just let us know whatever we can do to help you out with that.